Right now, you are not alone. Inside your mouth, on your skin, deep in your gut, there are creatures, billions of them. They are eating, moving, breeding, and dying on you and in you at this exact second. And there are more of them than there are stars you will ever see. You cannot feel them. You have never seen them. And for almost the entire history of the human race, no one knew they were there at all. Think about that. For thousands of years, people lived their whole lives covered in an invisible world, and not a single human being suspected it existed. They got sick and did not know why. They died in their beds from wounds that turned sour, from water that looked clean, from a cough passed hand to mouth. And they blamed bad air, angry gods, curses, and the alignment of the stars. The truth was smaller than any of that. The truth was living on their own fingertips. So how did we finally see it? Who was the first human being to look into a drop of ordinary water and realize it was crowded with life? To understand how strange this discovery was, you have to understand how blind people were before it. For most of history, when something rotted, people thought the rot simply appeared. Meat left out grew maggots, so maggots must be born from meat. Grain left in a barn drew mice, so mice must rise from grain. This idea had a name. It was called spontaneous generation, the belief that life could simply pop into existence from dead matter. And serious thinkers accepted it for over 2,000 years. Disease was explained the same lazy way. If a whole city fell ill, people said the air had gone bad. They called it miasma, a poisonous mist rising from swamps and filth. And they believed you got sick by breathing the stink of decay. It was not a foolish idea. It was simply wrong. And because everyone believed it, no one thought to look closer. Then came a man who had no business making one of the greatest discoveries in the history of science. His name was Antony van Leeuwenhoek, and he was not a doctor. He was not a professor. He sold cloth. He ran a fabric shop in the Dutch city of Delft in the 1600s. And cloth merchants used small glass lenses to count the threads in their fabric and check its quality. That is all his lenses were meant to do. But Van Leeuwenhoek became obsessed. He taught himself to grind glass into tiny, near-perfect beads, lenses no bigger than a pinhead, and he built small, handheld devices to hold them. These were not the microscopes you picture. They were little brass plates you held up to your eye like a peephole. Yet the best of his lenses could magnify an object more than 200 times, far beyond anything else in the world at the time. He looked at everything. He looked at bee stings and wood and the sting of a flea. And then, one day in the 1670s, he looked at a drop of water from a nearby lake. Let's rebuild that moment. Picture him at a wooden table, a single candle burning, holding a sliver of glass up toward the light. He brings the drop of water close to his eye. And there, in a puddle small enough to sit on a fingertip, he sees them. Things. Moving things. Tiny living creatures, spinning and darting and tumbling over one another, thousands of them in a single drop. He called them animalcules, meaning little animals, and he was so stunned he could barely describe what he was watching. He wrote that they moved with astonishing speed, that some rolled like tops, that they were so small that thousands of them together would not equal the size of a grain of sand. No human eye had ever seen this before. He was the first. He was looking at bacteria and single-celled life, an entire kingdom of living things, and he had found it hiding inside a drop of ordinary water. Then he did something even bolder. He scraped the white film off his own teeth, the soft gunk we now call plaque, and he put it under his lens, and it, too, was alive. His own mouth was a teeming city. He described creatures wriggling through the scrapings from between his teeth, moving like fish in water. He had found the invisible creatures that live on you by looking at himself. Now here's where the story turns. You would think the world would fall to its knees. You would think every scholar in Europe would rush to Delft to look through his lens. Instead, when Van Leeuwenhoek sent his findings to the Royal Society in London in 1676, the most respected group of scientists in the world, they did not believe him. Think about who he was to them. A cloth merchant, a man with no Latin, no university degree, no training, writing letters in plain Dutch, claiming that invisible animals lived in water and swarmed inside the human mouth. It sounded insane. It sounded like the fantasy of an amateur who had gotten confused by a smudge on his glass. So the Royal Society did something remarkable. They sent people to check. They found respected witnesses, including a clergyman, and had them look for themselves and confirm what Van Leeuwenhoek had seen. Only when others repeated it, only when the invisible world could be proven again and again, did the scientific world finally accept the truth. And even then, they missed the most important part. Because here's the twist that took another 200 years to sink in. Van Leeuwenhoek saw the creatures, but no one, not even him, understood what they did. For 2 centuries after his discovery, people knew these little animals existed and still did not connect them to disease. They watched them swim in water and never realized that some of them were the reason a fever could empty a village. That connection came later, and it came painfully. In 1847, in a hospital in Vienna, a doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis noticed something horrifying. In one ward, where doctors delivered babies, mothers were dying of a raging fever at a terrible rate. In another ward, run by midwives, far fewer women died. The difference made no sense until Semmelweis realized that the doctors were coming straight from dissecting dead bodies to delivering babies, without washing their hands. He guessed that they were carrying something invisible on their fingers, some deadly particle, from the corpses to the mothers. So he ordered the doctors to wash their hands in a chlorine solution, and the deaths plummeted. He was right. He had no idea what the invisible killer was, but he had found how to stop it. And for being right, he was mocked, dismissed, and driven out. Other doctors were insulted by the suggestion that their own clean hands were killing patients. Semmelweis was pushed from his position, his health and mind collapsed, and he died in an asylum, disgraced, years before the world admitted he had been correct all along. The proof he lacked came from others. In the 1860s, the French scientist Louis Pasteur showed that these tiny organisms, not bad air, caused liquids to spoil and could cause disease, finally destroying the old idea of spontaneous generation. Soon after, in 1867, a British surgeon named Joseph Lister applied the same thinking to the operating table, using antiseptics to kill germs during surgery, and watched deaths from infection fall away. Together they built what we now call germ theory, the simple, world-changing idea that specific, invisible living things cause specific diseases. Everything Van Leeuwenhoek had glimpsed in a drop of water finally had a meaning. The little animals were not just a curiosity. Some of them were the oldest killers of the human race, and they had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. So now, come back to your own body. Right now, on your skin, there are more microbes than there are people on Earth. In your gut, there are trillions of them, and most of them are not your enemies. They help you digest your food. They train your immune system. They make chemicals your body needs to survive. You are not a single creature at all. You are a walking colony, a partnership between you and an invisible ocean of life that outnumbers your own cells. When you press your palm to your mouth, you are doing the exact thing Van Leeuwenhoek did with his lens. You are touching the invisible world. The only difference is that now, at last, you know it is there. For thousands of years, humans lived and died, surrounded by a hidden kingdom they could not see and could not imagine. It took a cloth merchant with a homemade lens to reveal it, a disgraced doctor to prove it could kill, and 2 centuries of stubborn, painful science to finally believe it. And right now, as you breathe, as you read this, they are still with you. Billions of them, eating, moving, breeding, and dying on you and in you at this exact second. You are not alone. You never were.